pretty much the entire chapter 18 vocab, I've seen kids mess it up. These are words that look kind of similar but are actually not interchangeable. So when kids mean water table, they say groundwater. Or when kids mean percolation, they say infiltration. So just be careful that you don't mix up the chapter 18 vocab. I'd put a star next to that and just make sure you got those words straight. In chapter 19, natural versus cultural eutrophication, bioengineering, bioswale, and bioremediation. The concept that we can build stuff to work like it does naturally. 6, 7, and 8 get stars. 10. 13, 15, 16. 19, 21, 22. And sometimes kids ask which study goals should go together. If that helps you, 22 is about dams, and there's a whole bunch of others that are about dams. So if you want to study all your dam stuff together, next to dams, 22, please write 3, 10, 45, 48, 53 through 55. For kids who like to study together, those are all about dams. 24 gets a star. 25 and 26. I got to remind you that 25 was with our lab and our field trip. Six, I already said. 30, 31. 34, 35. 39. 45. 47, 48. 53, 54. I want to fill in a bunch of study goals, but first I have to apologize about your water bill. I know that all school feels like a waste of your time, and I know that a lot of work feels like busy work. From your point of view, I get that. But I don't know, from my point of view, I have to convince myself that the work I give you is for a reason, that I'm not wasting your time. And I do convince myself that I'm not just doing it for busy work. I'm really sorry to waste your time with the water bill. I did have an assignment lined up. I have the handouts I was going to give you that show you math that I thought would be helpful. I did intend to do something with your water bill. But it just didn't fit into my period 1 yesterday. I could see it was going to be even worse for periods 3 and 5. So I had to cancel that at the last minute, and I hate to do that. I don't like the idea that you would go home and go to all the trouble to do that stupid paper and you bring it in. And for some of you, it's no big deal, but some kids probably had to waste a lot of time on this, and I'm sorry to waste your time. I don't like to cancel work. I don't like to waste your time on stuff that isn't helpful. I had every intention of using that academically, and then the timing didn't fit. Sorry. Let's finish dams. Does anybody know where we left off in study goal 22, assignment 7.2? 7.2, study goal 22.
I don't know. Yeah, you were talking about below dam ecological.
Thank you.
Yeah. But we were like near the end of it, I think.
Okay.
We're talking about salinity. We said losses, riparian vegetation.
Okay.
Yeah, we were starting on human.
Okay. Saloni, will you hit the light? What I'm hearing from you is that your notes should include number 4, but maybe not number 5 yet. Is that correct?
We
Alright.
also talked about the salmon.
We did or did not talk about salmon?
You
Did.
started talking about the salmon and already we all.
Okay. A quick thing to say about the salmon in case I didn't get to make my point because of the bell. Dams are a huge problem for salmon, but there's a lot of dams without salmon in those rivers. So if you're worried about preserving salmon, then you have to mention the dams. But if you're just talking about dams, globally, most of them don't have salmon. So salmon problems are very specific to one part of the world. So I don't like to list salmon here, because to me, salmon are a very special problem. Let's go to humans, and remember that we're dividing this above the dam and below the dam. There's a big difference in how this is handled globally, but for one thing, when your reservoir fills, you lose land. Here in the United States, usually nowadays, if your land was going to be taken by the government, they'd give you money. Maybe you didn't want to sell grandpa's house, but whatever, you get like fair market value. In the United States, this is an inconvenience and maybe sad. But globally, there's a bunch of people who were just chilling on the front porch, and the river started to flood, and then it started to flood, and then it kept flooding, and then they lost their house, and they never knew what happened. Like, the loss of land in many parts of the world is not as gently managed legally as it is here. So this is a big social justice issue in some poor communities, where people just get flooded out of their homes with no warning and no recompensation. In the Three Gorges Dam, China just gave people a bunch of wheelbarrows in some areas and said, here, your house is going to be flooded next year, so here's a wheelbarrow, you got 1 year, you can move up there if you want. And people had to like disassemble their houses and like push them up the hill on wheelbarrows. There's like photographs of this. Oh! The guy, Edward Burtinsky, took photographs of people disassembling and moving their houses. Edward Burtinsky, the guy that made that movie that everybody thought was the most boring of the year. Manufactured Landscapes, do you remember the one about the photographer? Something we lose is archaeological resources. These are probably all too dirty. They're especially down by the sink.
We're just cleaning water off the floor. Yeah, that's all that they got mad at.
There's a lot of archaeology next to rivers, because does everybody understand humans have always lived near water? And some parts of the world have a lot of history near water. Like, for example, the United States, where we have like thousands and thousands and thousands of archaeological sites along the Colorado River. Cultures were made and lost and remade, and battles and developments and religions and languages came and went along the Colorado River. And when we started to flood Lake Powell, for example, a whole bunch of archaeologists were up in arms, like, dude, we have like burial grounds and cave art and like ceremonial sites. Please don't bury our stuff. And especially like in the 1940s and 50s, that was not like a huge priority to preserve historical artifacts. And so they just flooded that. So here's a crazy detail. America is the world leader in underwater archaeology because we flooded all of our history on the Colorado River, and a lot of archaeologists were like, wait, I still want to work on that. And so there's like hundreds of American archaeologists that are like scuba certified, and like now when they find like a ship that sank off the coast of Greece, they're like, oh, call the Americans, they're really good at underwater archaeology. So we've become famous globally.
Because they're stupid and flooded our history.
Oh, you know, because we're resourceful and witty. We don't let little things like flooding erase our history.
Like, purposeful.
But we tried. We flooded anyway. Another problem for humans is that dams just don't last very long. And I gotta be really specific, the dams themselves last a long ass time. The reservoirs don't last very long because they fill up with sand. Some of you are aware that if we don't empty it, the Santa Barbara Harbor would fill up completely with sand every 2 years. Every 9 months or so, we have to start the machinery that spends 3 months dredging the harbor. How many of you are aware that we dredge the harbor? That's just because where water slows down, it drops all of its sediment. So if you have a silty ass river and you're slowing down the water, then all that sediment is going to settle. So technically, the dam lasts a really long time. But the reservoirs fill in with sediment until they're useless. This is especially true in desert places like the Colorado River.
Can they not use some of like the electricity to dredge it?
Well, yeah and no. So sand is not that complicated of a problem,
But aren't the reservoirs like 300 feet deep?
but the physics and logistics of that are really tricky, and the volumes of sand are staggering. Our big reservoirs, the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, they fill at a rate of 2 dump trucks of sand per minute. No, per second. Per second.
Yeah, never mind.
So like, if you imagine those dump trucks leaving, you know, like 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. Like imagine that freeway, like 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000. It would just be back to back to back, just bumper cars, dump trucks. That's just the natural flow of sediment. You know, it's a big ass river and it's in the middle of the fricking desert. That's like hundreds or maybe thousands of square miles of sand. And all that water has to pour over that sand into the river, and that's been sand for a bazillion years. So pretty much every drop of rain is pushing a sand, you know, a little grain of sand. And like all of that's supposed to go down the river, and when you slow it down, it's just going. So yeah, you could just open it and let the sediment out. But A, it's a ton of sediment, and B, like any place that you're slowing the water, you're gonna have that problem. We'll come back to this. This is why we can't get rid of the big dams. Getting ahead of myself for study goal number 23, this is why we can't get rid of the dams. It's 7. Okay. Explaining number 1 downhill is really difficult. Because I have to teach you something you've probably never thought of to explain why there's a problem. Raise your hand if you know where Venice, Italy is. Perhaps visited or at least know that it's a thing. And have you heard that the city's sinking? So there's a really simple explanation for this. Sediment tends to end up in coastlines because rivers, and that's where water slows down and wave action. And when we build on a coastal area, groundwater moving to the ocean takes sediment with it. Where groundwater exits to the sea, there's like a net flow of silt. Since all groundwater is going out to the ocean, then all silt is kind of being carried to the ocean. Part of the rock cycle. And what that means is, if you build a house on the coastline is going to sink because the ground is being swept out from underneath it. That's what's happening to Italy. Sorry, to Venice. That's one of the many problems that Venice has. Now, rivers normally bring a supply of sediment. So coastal areas do this, but rivers help heal that. And so, because dams lose sediment, because dams steal the sediment, dams speed up coastal sinking. Dams accelerate coastal subsidence. Yeah?
Is that kind of the same idea of a cone of depression? Or is that different?
So cones of depression are the shape of the water table. I would say they're different.
It's like when you like have at the beach, you have like your puddle and you try to like fill it with sand and it just doesn't work. You know when you dig a hole at the beach
I think you're just bad at sand.
and you try to fill the hole
I seem to be able to fill my holes in the sand every time.
when you're down by the water?
Why would you fill the hole?
The part I can't do is keep them dry because water keeps coming back up. But if I fill it with sand, I can fill the hole with sand. I think you're not trying hard enough. Get back. Hire a resourceful 7-year-old.
Why would you dig a hole if you didn't fill that?
Physics.
We can fight about the beach another time.
We should have a field trip.
And we can make fun of Casey at a later time. Have you noticed that I go to the beach on every one of my field trips?
Well, yeah, but like we should have a field trip. Let's just beach.
Let's just be.
Remember that thing about using your time judiciously?
No.
No, you wouldn't. Hey, why is the Fertile Crescent fertile?
Sediment.
From where?
The mountains.
The Dead Sea, the Red Sea.
Does anybody know where the Fertile Crescent is?
Over there.
What rivers?
Tigris and Euphrates.
Good job. What makes the Fertile Crescent fertile
Flooding.
is the sediment
Sexy Egyptians.
from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I need you to first of all remember that blocking the sediment means that you're blocking the agricultural supply downriver. But then I need you to write something else. We got to be a little bit specific with our language. Quiet, boys. We got to be a little specific with our language. Sediment does not equal nutrients. Sediment plus decomposers make nutrients. Right? Like compost is not nutrients technically. Compost is a bunch of decomposers that are making nutrients. We got to be kind of specific with our lingo. I'm looking out for you. Kids mess this up all the time. Sediment does not equal nutrients. Sediment plus decomposers make nutrients.
But how do decomposers turn non-biotic material into nutrients?
So sediment is a blend of inorganic stuff, that is what we call sand, and then organic material that can be decomposed. And so, like, when we say that rivers carry sediment, that includes biotic material, like bird poop and chunks of leaves and like the shell
So,
of
like,
a beetle.
sediment is like the sand and the algae.
Yeah. That's what becomes fossil fuels. It's not the sand part, it's the organic material within there. So you understood that they were blended in fossil fuels, that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
So like what you just said about like the sediment not equal stuff like that, what's like the relevance to what like
Okay, so farmers don't need more sand delivered to their farm, per se. The way that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers make an area that's very fertile is not because they dump pure clean sand on them. It's because those rivers carry stuff too, like dead giraffe or whatever the hell's in Egypt. Camels?
No? Not
Am I
giraffe.
racist?
Old
probably
woolly
racist.
mammoths.
Humans.
Hey, I don't know where anything is anyway.
I'm
Uh,
pretty sure Tigris and Euphrates are not in Egypt.
Right, they're in Iraq.
They are in like the Arabic part of the
Whatever. Yeah, it's definitely not Egypt.
Welcome to America.
Yeah, right. I don't have to know, David.
The Tigris and Euphrates.
Now that you're here, you have to forget them. We just look inward here. Love it or leave it, buddy. The reason that those two rivers make good farmland is not because of the sand. It's because that water carries other organic material that will decompose to make nutrients available. So we got to distinguish that sediment does not equal per se nutrients, but decomposers can make nutrients from some of that stuff. Yeah.
Does the water carry the decomposers or the materials of the decomposers?
They tend to travel together. They tend to travel together. So those decomposers wouldn't be present if there wasn't organic material. The organic material usually is food for decomposers, so wherever it lands, decomposers tend to thrive. One big problem downriver is the collapse of fisheries. And pretty much every dam on the planet has affected fisheries downriver. God, we're all dying. And INTOL stands for international. There are a significant and tragic number of international relationships that were ruined by dams.
You look very together.
I like that.
When it comes out, it's like light and light on it.
All right. Unless you wanted to ask me something, I'm done with assignment 7.2. Oh, no, I'm not. I lied. Totally lied. I want to look at study number 23 really fast, and then we're done.
You don't even have one.
Number 23 says, what are the pros and cons of dam removal?
Pros, no more dam, cons, you can't do it.
That's pretty much, Sadie kind of nailed it. I want to get a couple of details added to that. Sadie said pros, no more dams. And that is actually a clear and obvious real benefit that dam removal helps rivers like right away. Like right away. The day after you remove a dam, the river starts to do its thing again, and that is globally beneficial. So the ecology is sudden, immediate. All right, fine. Stop talking. We're kind of behind schedule. Excuse me. We gotta move on. We gotta move on. We've been a little too loose today. We gotta move on. The problems with dam removal though are that first of all, it's extremely expensive no matter what. For a small dam, we say it's 10 times more expensive to take it out than it was to put it in. You know, like putting a dam in, you get to use gravity. And like all you gotta do is carry the dry weight of the concrete as light material, but you pour it down a hill to build the dam. Now if you gotta get rid of that, it's like kind of mechanically difficult to break it up and then lift it and then dispose of it in big chunks. So as a basic rule of thumb, we say for small dams, it's just really expensive, 10 times. For big dams, it's essentially impossible, especially in the desert. Because of that sediment thing, there's just no way to deal with all the sediment. The sediment volumes are too high. And this is one of those times in my class where I gotta give you really bad news. Your generation is screwed.
What else is new?
Yeah, right, you hear this all the time. There's a lot of problems we can fix and a lot of things that we just gotta pull off, but it's kind of tricky. But for the dams, we really don't have a plan. We have 11 dams on the Colorado River. The two biggest ones are half filled with sediment right now. So in the next 60 to 80 years, they will be at capacity with sand. And then if the river goes over the top, erosion starts to break that, and then you get the crazy, scary-ass tidal wave of muddy death. Which, if it starts at the top, would be a domino of death.
I have a question about that. Wouldn't it be just like a waterfall and then the natural flow of the river would resume with a new nice little waterfall there?
Well,
No, there's no
No,
water.
It's like an actual question.
it's fine, it's fine. So like, for a split second, yeah, for a while, yeah. So some water would just go over the top. The problem is that when that water starts to move, it carries stuff. So eventually you'd have like boulders and rocks migrating over, and now you've got a little pneumatic hammer. And you know, water erodes things. Yeah.
I mean, like the water itself would like just dig a hole, like in front of the dam, so there would be like just a big hole and the dam would fall.
And then it could undermine the dam itself where it lands, you know? Like, I don't know. We'll see what happens if the water goes over the top. Hopefully we never have to deal with that. The scary thing is that you're starting to flirt with the failure of the dam when they fill up. And we know that they're going to fill up because physics, slowing down water, you fill them with sediment. That's just a thing. And we really, truly, honestly don't have a vision of how to resolve this. So I got to hurry up because we're already behind. Let's see if I need these questions later. Hold on. Probably the idea of removing the sediment is essentially impossible because of the 2 dump trucks per second problem. Keep in mind, 2 dump trucks per second is just canceling the input. If you want to remove the backlog, right, then you would need like 4 per second. If it's like a 2-hour round trip, you can do the math. That's like 14,000 dump trucks or whatever. So there's just no way to logistically remove that much sand. Another option would be they can just drain out the sand. If they just open all the jets, the water movement will eventually lift and carry all that sediment. But all that's going to do is fill up the downhill one. And if you start at the Mexican border, dump all the sediment, take apart the dam, that would be like a 100-year event of sediment over like 10 or 20 years. Then you're going to take like 60 or 80 or 100 years to reach the top, and by then a few would already be predicted to fail. So the only really viable option that anybody has said that I've heard that seems to make kind of a remote maybe idea is to dig a fake river around the reservoirs. But now you're talking like digging Grand Canyon size holes?
Why would that help digging like a river around the river?
Because then you could just kind of have a flowing river again,
Oh, I see.
and then just ignore the dam just becomes landscape. Plant some corn in it. Did that address your two questions?
Yeah.
If you just like blew up a dam.
That would be,
Breaking them is easy.
that would be bad.
Let's be really, 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 really clear. You know, like after September 11, the United States did like this big security study to see what our big national liabilities are. And if you hit one of the top dams with like a little tiny crop duster, it makes the domino effect of death. On some dam, they figured out that there's a point where you can drive off a scenic overlook with a heavy van and break a dam. The dams are very fragile, so breaking them is easy. Dealing with that volume of material is not easy. And so that's about 10% of America's population in the floodplain. That's the electricity and water supply for something like 16 or 18% of America's population. So it's actually like really severe consequences.
So
Yeah.
Why didn't you dig a fake river when they just can open the tunnels that they made when they were building the dams?
Because those are only rated to like average flow,
Oh, and then there's this water storage.
but like 30 to 40% of the time you're above average flow. Because 49.9% of the time you're above average flow, yeah.
So they can't just
Yeah.
slowly drain them?
I guess like
Like just kind of,
slowly drain them means you're beating what's normal for the river, and how much time do you think you have? So if you go like double the natural flow rate, you still have many years to wait.
So they can't just
And double the natural flow rate is actually like pretty catastrophic for those rivers. Can you imagine the rivers at twice its volume?
If the domino effect would happen if you broke like the top 10, what if you went backwards? Like what if you started from the bottom
Right.
and went
And
up?
so like that would have been logical before we started, but it takes too long to reach the top ones, and those are the ones that are the most scary. Like this is an honestly fascinating engineering challenge that your generation will have to deal with for sure somehow. All I need is 15 good years, and then I'm retiring to Mexico, and I don't care what you do.
what about we make a giant wall around the river and then flood it?
That would probably be a step in the right direction. I mean,
Building walls.
I see you like building walls. The logistics of that might be a little bit overwhelming, but yeah, that would resolve the flooding issue and just get you to dump it all. Yeah.
What if they don't just little tiny holes in all of the dams?
Yeah, I was
Wait, so you said that, like, with the thing about the dump trucks, are you saying that dams fill with 2 dump trucks of sediment every second?
Right. Right. You know, like think about a place like Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam. 3 separate rivers flow into that reservoir. That's at a confluence of 3 rivers, right? And that watershed includes, you should Google it, 930 something square miles of desert. So like the sediment load on a good rain is basically just mud water. Like when those rivers run, it's mud. All right, children, all right. Now I'm done with assignment 7.2, and we're only 20 minutes behind schedule.
Today's the last day. What are the test grades going?
What?
What are the test grades going?
Never. All right. Please take out assignment 7.3. There's a few study goals I'd like to talk about. Oh, you got them? Leave them on the back table, but close, please.
You're running out of water.
Yeah, we might have to stuff some things into the place where those drawers went on the bottom. There may already be stuff there, but usually I put my food and eggs down there so I can use all the racks for water. But yeah, it's pretty, like, that should fill it.
Yeah, it's pretty full. I think there's a few more. We got
Yeah.
all of those.
Nice. Okay, back to me, please. And I love this class and I like all of you, but I'm stressing about the time, so stop your 40,000 conversations. In assignment 7.3, we've talked about almost everything. I would like to look over 26 and 27, then 30. For study goal number 26, I just want to give you a heads up. In study goal number 26, students often explain this wrong. Eutrophication is extra nutrients.
That's about it. Here, you want some?
Extra nutrients is not a problem. Extra nutrients just means more food web, more life. That's not a problem. If you want to check your notes, the problem is not the extra nutrients. The problem starts when those nutrients run out. Because then all the extra life will starve, die, and decomposition makes a dead zone. Decomposers use up all the oxygen. So eutrophication is bad in oceans. Coastal eutrophication is bad because those nutrients eventually run out. If you just had a high nutrient part of the ocean, that would just be a thriving ecosystem. Like a lot of nutrients just means a lot of producers, just means a lot of consumers. That's not a problem yet.
So it's cultural eutrophication, you mean?
Well, even natural eutrophication in coastal areas can be a problem if it's seasonal, right? In a lot of desert areas, you accumulate biomass on land. You have a short period with a lot of rainfall, like in the Mediterranean. When all those materials hit the ocean, or all those nutrients hit the ocean, you get a burst of productivity, and then when the dry season starts, the nutrients dry up, and you get that same die-off, same decomposers use up the oxygen. Natural eutrophication can still be a problem. You can still get dead zones from natural as well. As long as there's a rhythm, like there's a season. If there's like an ending point of the nutrients, then you get a dead zone. P.S. That's study goal 27. If you did the right notes for 26, you already have that in number 27. There was an article in your book, a closer look, chapter 19.2, that talks about the Gulf of Mexico, how they get these huge dead zones. You could avoid that by having coastal wetlands that soak up nutrients. And I would like to clarify what red tide is. And if anybody wants a crazy thing to search on your cell phones during seminar, I've got an interesting one for you. So please look up. Algae, green algae, blue-green algae, red algae. Within the red algae, there are a few species that are toxic. Some of them are toxic to humans, some are toxic to shellfish, some are toxic to fish. So, algae, blue-green algae, red algae is kind of rare to begin with, and then within the red algae, there's a few species that are really dangerous. Okay, Algae bloom, red tide. A red tide is an algae bloom that favors those rare toxic red algae. Red tide is an algae bloom of toxic algae. If you know somebody who fishes crab in Santa Barbara, you might have heard that they get pissed in the fall because the federal government will often close our crab fisheries because crab eats algae that falls to the bottom of the ocean, and sometimes we have algae blooms that include red algae. So sometimes they'll shut down the crab fishery because it would be hazardous for people to eat a whole lot of crab. That's a red tide issue. Maybe you know that the manatees in St. Petersburg, Florida were threatened by a red tide earlier this year. And if you want to look up one of the most fascinating organisms on our planet, get ready to write this. It's a really difficult word. You'll never remember it. Please write down, if you're curious, just for nerds, Pfisteria piscicida. It is spelled Pfisteria. That's Pfisteria. 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 Piscicida, like killing fish. Pisces, like homicide, but for Pisces. Pisci. Cida.
Piscida?
Piscicida. Piscicida. Which means something which kills fishes. Here's the reason why I think that's awesome. Pfisteria piscicida is a rare red tide species that kills fish. It gives them like lesions, which makes the fish toxic for humans to eat. But here's the crazy part. When that algae blooms, it makes these spores on the surface of the ocean that are invisible, odorless and flavorless, but deadly to humans. So boats will sail through a patch of Pfisteria piscicida and the crew drops dead on the deck. And nerds have suggested that this is the basis for like the story of the sirens who kill the sailors, and may explain like Bermuda Triangle mysteries and what are called ghost ships, which are seafaring vessels that are adrift with no living crew. Yeah.
So do they breed in the algae?
Yeah, so it's not the algae itself, but it's the spores, the reproductive stuff, kind of like pollen, you know, like it. But they're spores, it's like a zygote that goes into the air. Anyway, when you're bored, you should Google this Pfisteria stuff. It is like so gnarly. People will eat fish that have it in them and not know this and have like their liver turn to juice and stuff. It's like nar-nar. Super nar-nar.
Where does the red algae poisonous thing live?
This particular one, Pfisteria piscicida, I believe is global.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
But red tide species occur all over the planet.
Right.
Do we have any, like, specific to our area?
I would assume so, but I'm not an expert on alga. Technically, red tide algae isn't even algae. Like, they're bacteria, I believe. Because they're red. Alright. Skip down to study goal number 30. And then we're done with this assignment. In study goal number 30, it says outline the environmental impacts of sediment pollution. And here's a shocker that will frustrate you at the last minute of our unit.
Sediment doesn't pollute.
Well, we've talked about sediment as a good thing until right now. And in the last 30 minutes of the water unit, sediment can also be a problem if you have too much.
Everything can be a problem if you have
Right,
too
so
much.
it's not that big of a shocker, but there's this thing called sediment pollution, which is just when you have too much of it.
Well, yeah, it's like put some rocks in the
Okay, fine, maybe you're not that surprised. So, sediment pollution is the #1 greatest water pollutant by volume. Boys, I'll take that water home today, and I'll take my food Tupperware home, and we can throw out all those salsas.
Throw out the salsas right now.
Wait, did you say #1 source of water pollution by volume?
Yeah, it is the most voluminous water pollutant.
What about your Jello? Do you want your Jello?
Did you say Jello? That must be one of the TAs. That ain't me.
I'll leave the Jello.
Grown men don't eat Jello.
That's fine.
Mate, pudding.
Nice save, play.
You
Nice
should
save.
eat Jello, just hold your mouth.
Sex appeal.
There are actually some fascinating cultural references about grown men and Jello. Oh, also something grown men don't.
That's how he deals with you.
Alright, so greatest water pollutant by volume. As an example, sediment pollution is the biggest threat to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia.
The starfish were.
Those are another big threat. Yeah, those basket of thorns, crown of thorns. I met a guy that figured out a biological control for the crown of thorns. Yeah, his arm is. There are 5 ways that sediment pollution is a threat ecologically. I'd like you to know all 5. You can write these down. Number 1, sediment will clog canals.
choke stream.
Yeah, choke streams.
But we don't like canals.
Well, canals can be ecologically damaging, but if you live near one, you need them. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't like that we rely on. Like I don't like fossil fuels, but I need to get to work tomorrow. Number 2, sediment buries vegetation. Vegetation is obviously important. It's the productive base of all food webs, and sediments can often cover up vegetation. Number 3, it makes water heat up more. Because sediment captures, absorbs light, and then radiates heat.
Heat up more, heat up faster.
Both?
Buries vegetation.
Yeah.
Isn't this the same issues with dams?
Well, the same sediment that fills in dams is a problem when we make too much of it, especially when it hits the ocean. Sediments make water heat up more. Number 4, sediment blocks sunlight. So sunlight doesn't reach the bottom. And problem number 5, sediment smothers egg beds. It covers up the places in the rocks where stuff breeds.
If there isn't a chance for sun to shine on the bottom, then does that make that part really, really cold?
The
Heat transfer.
in bodies of water that don't have a lot of sediment, water's very clear. When you have sediment throughout the water column, you're heating up all parts of the water column, so that water tends to heat up more than when sunlight, which is filtered by water, hits the bottom, and that's your only source of heat. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
There are 5 main sources of sediment you have to know, and this will show up in the next unit because sediment is also a source of air pollution. The 5 sources are number 1, logging, which you probably remember because clear cuts have a lot of erosion. So that's where sediment comes from, is when it washes away on land. Logging, especially clear cuts. Farming, especially high tillage.
Is that number 2?
Yeah, that's the second one. Third source, you may never have thought of this, but construction makes a lot of dust. Number 4, you never see this one because you live in this country, but dirt roads are by far the most common. And all those cars driving over dirt roads makes a lot of mud. And number 5, something else we don't have to look at is mines. But there are a lot of mines out there and they make a lot of sediment. That list of 5 sources, you're going to need that again in the next unit. Word for word. I'm done with assignment 7.3 unless you have questions for me. Then please take out a blank sheet of paper. Like a half sheet might be enough. Half sheet might suffice.
Roughly 75.
We're about to get to some of that. Not all of it, but we'll get to that one. I told you that assignment 7.4 was canceled as an in-class assignment because I didn't want to show a second movie, but it is still important that you know about the Colorado River. It is by far the most famous set of dams on Earth. When anybody else on the planet is building dams, they look to the Colorado River. Because it's so famous, the College Board really does ask a ton of questions about the Colorado. So I've got a page of trivia. I don't really know word for word what's going to be on the AP test, but they do ask a lot about the Colorado River. It was first seen by Europeans in 1804. The Lewis and Clark expedition visited. Lewis and Clark visited the Colorado River.
First seen by European humans? Or like...
What?
First documented?
It was loosely mapped. When somebody came to map it correctly, they said it was impossible. That was 1857. So the first attempt to fully map it failed. The explorer said, no can do.
Because it was too long, or like
Too narnar.
they just wanted to go home?
It was too narnar. You know, it's deep in the canyon. Like, it's actually pretty gnarly to do that. A lot of rivers you can just walk around. But imagine the Grand Canyon. Like, we gotta hike up that to get back down that, so they just kind of got over it. The first person to actually go from top to bottom was a really famous name that I'd like you to know. In 1869, John Wesley Powell, as in Lake Powell, John Wesley Powell, was the first person to go from snow to Mexico.
What do you mean to go like completely across it or like around it?
He navigated every inch of the river. Today, that's considered to be like an extreme feat. Like, more people have been to Everest than have done the whole river. And technically, this guy was like probably one of the burliest humans America's ever had. You don't need to write this down, but just FYI, he was a veteran of the Civil War who lost an arm in battle, also defeated a bear in battle.
In the Civil War?
In the Civil War, like they were all like resting and like trying to recover from a fight, and like
Which
a
side
bear
was he
came
on?
through trying to eat their dead, and like one-armed 60-year-old John Wesley Powell fought back a bear.
Wait, which side was he
I would assume the North, but I don't know. After World War,
Which arm was
after the Civil War, after the Civil War, and he was on the right. After the Civil War, he was kind of bored and like, what the hell am I gonna do with my life? Like he's in his 60s and he hated everything. And so he signed up for this like expedition that nobody really wanted to take to map to Colorado. He hired a bunch of like young whippersnappers to work for him. They all either quit or died on the river. I believe he sustained 18 deaths to his staff in the course of running the river. And over and over and over, there's all these stories about how his crew would be like, nah, I'm not doing this. And he'd be like, hold on a minute. And he would like tie a sliding knot, slip his good arm, choke up on a rope that was tied to the bow cleat of his like 16-foot wooden rowboat. And then he'd say, before you quit, push me into this river. And like, there's like numerous spots on the river where his crew would portage around and they would just push him in and be like, hopefully he'll die this time. And they would get back down the canyon and they'd find him like washed up, like tied to a piece of metal with a bunch of rubble around. They would like rebuild more boats for him and he'd be like, ah, and he like kept going. He eventually like got all the way out to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico and like kicked off his rowboat. It was like America, and he like got on a horse and went back. And he told the government, "Here's your stupid map. Here's your stupid map, and do not build anything on that river. It is deadly and way too gnarly." So a lot of historians hated that they named Lake Powell after him. Because like his last great accomplishment was arguing that you shouldn't build reservoirs on the Colorado.
Do you know how he ended up dying?
I don't. I don't.
He never did.
Yeah, exactly. I would assume he's still out there juggling chainsaws one-handed.
You go onto the Colorado River and when you make a disturbance, he just comes out and slaps.
That's right, comes out of the water. A little messy.
He's real messy.
I should point out that there's like unbelievable stories about this guy, and the reason I wanted you to write his name is because honestly, like, this dude was like a hardcore badass, and I'm really impressed by that. 1922 is an important date about the Colorado River. 1922. Probably the stupidest law was written in 1922. In 1922, we made what's called the Colorado River Pact. Might be called the Colorado River Compact, maybe? Anyway, I don't know that it does. I think you'd recognize it if you saw it. The deal was to divide the water in the Colorado River. Please look at the map. Look at the map. Between the mountain states and the desert states. And I believe the guy who would become President Hoover, before he was president, sat down all the mountain states and all the desert states and said, okay, stop fighting over the water. You get 50% for the desert states and 50% for the mountain states. If you're good at math, that means 0% for Mexico and 0% for native tribes.
Hey.
But when he made this 50-50 deal, which was a pretty logical way to deal with this, he didn't write down in the law a percentage. they wrote down a number of gallons based on the flow that year, which just happened to be like the highest river levels ever recorded in the Colorado River. Kind of a stupid move. So they had like 1 million gallons, and so he said, you guys get 500,000 and you guys get 500,000, but it's never rained as much since 1922. So this is a fascinating detail about US history. We have a 100-year-old law that's been stupid for 100 years.
Haven't changed it?
And we haven't changed it to my knowledge. It still hasn't succeeded because nobody wants to give up the number. If I told you you get 500,000 and you know that it's never going to happen, that means you get to rip them off.
But then they get to rip you off, so who gets ripped off?
So why would anybody want to give away that number? Everybody's in this stalemate where they're like, nope, not renegotiating. You wrote it down. It's law. And like, just for people that are interested in legal issues, this is like a famous example of how like nobody has any idea about science. Okay. There's never a grown-up in the room. There's never a grown-up in the room.
Okay, but how do you write that down? Like 1922?
Stupid law.
Set to law unreasonable water allotments. Like those states are fighting for a shrinking amount of water ever since. 1931 started. 1933 first concrete.
You mean dam construction started?
1935 finished Hoover Dam. 31 started, 33 first concrete, 35 finished Hoover Dam.
Is he named after President Hoover?
Nah.
It is, and coincidentally, it wasn't called Hoover Dam at the time. It was called Boulder Dam, and somebody dedicated it to him way later, maybe at his death. Within 20 years, we got so excited that we built dams all over the US. By 1955, we had more than 100 major dams. We had more than 50 on one single river.
What river?
The Columbia River. And some of you might know that the Columbia River has a lot of salmon. So by 1956, America had lost half its salmon. I have just a couple of dates left for you to write down, and these can go kind of fast. From 56 to 63, we built Glen Canyon Dam. Which is the largest in the US now. I think it's the largest. By 1967, we had a total of 11 on the Colorado River. Total of 11. And that's kind of where it stopped. Did anybody here see the David Brower? I mean, I have other dates, but did anybody see the David Brower movie at the beginning of the year called Monumental? Where they talk about how he made a deal with the federal government that they could build one dam if they wouldn't build a dam somewhere else, and he was haunted by that until the day died.
It was like the first movie, right?
Yeah, it was the first movie of the year, the David Brower movie. So the reason that I mentioned that is 1967 was the year when that happened. It was a famous Sierra Club deal with the federal government. And that sort of marked the end of major dam projects in the US. So like we stopped all major dams in the US by 1969. No major dams after 1969 in the U.S. Minor dams all over, but no big ones. And there's one last date I gotta tell you. It's 1983. We almost lost one. Yeah.
Which one?
So, please look up. Please look up. Rainy season. Lake Powell had reached the limit at the end of the rainy season. Everything according to plan. And all of a sudden, like a perfect storm scenario came together. Where like unexpected water volume, unexpected heat, unexpected cold. Like holy crap, we're about to get a big ass rain tomorrow. So they opened all the drains to try to let some water out of Lake Powell. It was running full blast for 24 hours, and then it starts to rain, but it was like a big rain. So as the reservoir was draining, it started to flood, and it went over the limits, and literally was like up to the curb on the bridge. And the water pressure was so tremendous when all the gates are open and the thing is full that like stuff started to move on the bottom of the reservoir that had never moved before. So like rocks started to go through all of the tunnels, and then boulders started to go through all the tunnels, and they started to break all the concrete. So at the exit of the tunnels, like pieces of rebar and like chunks of concrete and like old boats that had sank in the reservoir started to like come shooting out, and people were like, she's gonna blow, we're gonna lose it. So they like evacuated cities and stuff, and the rain stopped at like the nick of time, and it still took like a month to get the water levels back to a safe amount before they could close the tunnels and patch everything up, and it all turned out just fine. But boy, that was a close call. Famous, 1983.
Which dam is that one?
Glen Canyon Dam, which is Lake Powell. I'd like to talk about some articles in the Reader, and then we're done. If you could please take out your Reader.
Are we gonna go over like the study goals, or are you just gonna talk about like what we write down on how it?
So if Glen Canyon Dam had like broken at that time, like what would have been the ramifications of that? Since they evacuated everyone.
I honestly can't even imagine. It would have been really, 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 really bad.
Like what cities?
We get a map. I don't know, dude. Sorry. I don't know. Alright. Looking at the Reader, we're almost done. Just a couple words. I like it when you write a couple words on your articles just in case. 37, 38 are probably just FYI. 39 is on the AP test like every year. Zooplankton versus phytoplankton. The definition that you're going to need is that plankton can't control its movement in water. Boys, quiet. But plankton can't control its movement in water. It doesn't have to be small. Please look up. There's plankton this big. It's the larva of an eel that just makes like a big flesh sail, and the water moves it. Plankton just means that they can't control their movement. Zooplankton is animal kind, phyto is plant kind. Uh, 42 seems to show up on the AP test a lot. 43 might be outdated, but the ratios are still correct. 45 is a big whoop. Raise your hand if you've ever seen footage of salmon going up waterfalls. Maybe you've seen it in real life. So I got to see this in Alaska, and I kid you not, like a 10-foot waterfall, the fish will jump into the waterfall, and as they start to fall backward, they kick and jump out of the waterfall higher into the waterfall. And as they start to fall with the water, they jump out of falling water until they get up. Amazing. Critical thing to remember, that takes a lot of work, and that's okay, because cold water holds a lot of dissolved oxygen. Hot water does not hold dissolved oxygen. So warm water fish are lazy. Warm water fish chill. If you're on the beach in Jamaica, you don't really feel like doing a lot of work. So here's what you should know. To make a dam friendly to salmon, they use ladders because it's cold water. Cold water has salmon ladders, a bunch of pools that overflow into each other like a natural river. Like we saw on the field trip. For salmon, you use ladders, but for warm water fish, please look up, they don't jump, they're chilling, so they go around. It's called a bypass canal. That article is about a bypass canal. Cold water ladders, warm water canals. (47) through 51 is like this one handout that the city makes, which I think is really helpful for the AP test. The College Board always asks for solutions, and your city is really good at that. Santa Barbara is one of the most green cities in America, so that handout is about how our town does a bunch of progressive solutions to water problems. 54 is a fascinating research project that proves sediment is good for rivers.
Wait, which question is that?
54 was a fascinating research project that proves sediment is good for rivers. And just because I'm a nerd, I put in 55 so that you could see that fish. Like, that's what Santa Barbara fish would be like if we had managed stuff better.
You mean
56, sorry, the last page. Sorry, please look up. Look at the size of that friggin' salmon. That was caught in Mission Canyon. Like, what if we just maintained our ecosystem so that we could eat wild food? Love that idea. We only have 2 minutes. Can I get 5 volunteers to pass back the Unit 6 stuff? Let's go. 4 volunteers. 3. Need 3 more. 2. 1 more person. 1 more person. There has to be a good person out there. All right. Thank you. If you help pass out papers, we'll be ready.
I don't like most
Homeboy, will you raise
I
my
like
mic?
fish like that aren't fishy, like I like halibut.
You actually do the same 100%.
Where's your whiteboard? It's so
I like sushi. I like any raw fish.
I mean, you take a
So
photo
all
of
I honestly wish I did. Because they don't even look like I just don't like
They say it.
and I was like, I wish I like
Brooke, will you stop screaming?
no, so I like burgers when I was a kid, like I would take my sister to